Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing Louis Buñuel's L'Âge d'Or. Released in 1930, this film was a success, but also quite a scandal. So much of a scandal, in fact, that a number of patrons tore the theater to pieces. We'll be talking about why exactly that sort of thing would have happened and other matters after the film. Today, our guests are Professor Annette Michelson of New York University and Professor Stuart Liebman of Queens College. Enjoy, or at least be intrigued by, L'Âge d'Or.
Yale, Princeton,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody.
We've got to. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. If you've just joined us, we have two guests this evening, or more accurately today, and we'll have a chance to be chatting at length about L'Âge d'Or with them. Let me introduce them to you now. My first guest is Professor Annette Michelson. She's a professor in the graduate program in cinema studies at New York University. She's a distinguished scholar of the theory, practice, and history of the avant-garde cinema with significant specialties in Soviet, American, and French avant-garde, contemporary and historical. In addition to that, she's one of the founders and a co-editor of October, a distinguished magazine of the arts, which covers bases in a number of ways. It's one of the most provocative forums of intellectual exchange. My second guest is Professor Stuart Liebman. He's an associate professor of cinema studies in the Department of Communication Arts and Studies at Queens College. His specialty includes as well the avant-garde, with a significant specialization, is published significantly in the French avant-garde of the 1920s. He also is a scholar of the American avant-garde and has more recently been doing research on the new German cinema, more specifically the cinema of Alexander Kluge.
Very good.
Okay? So, L'Âge d'Or is quite a provocation to all kinds of things. I was thinking, Stuart, you might fill us in a little bit on some of the background to it. I mean, what kind of context did this film come out of, historically and aesthetically?
Well, perhaps it might be best to begin with the history of Buñuel himself.
Okay.
Buñuel was an extremely precocious young man who studied in Spain. Clearly, he responded to the lure of Paris, which was, for many, many decades, of course, something that few ambitious European intellectuals could resist. He came to Paris in 1925, hoping to study music, but being a somewhat wayward character by his own description, he quickly became seduced by that art form that all across Europe, throughout the 20s, enchanted, delighted, fascinated a whole generation of European intellectuals. In Paris, he had a number of opportunities to learn his trade, most prominently with the then very, very important director, sadly underrated director, Jean Epstein, Franco-Polish origin. And he trained at a small school that Epstein ran in order to staff his own production crews.
Right.
And from that point, he became involved with a number of Epstein productions, including the first independent production that Epstein produced called Mauprat, from the Georges Sand novel. And he met a number of people who had become very, very important to him in his early filmmaking career, including Albert Duverger, who became the cameraman for both Un Chien de Loup, his first film in Paris, as well as L'Âge d'Or, the film that apparently the viewers have just seen. He quarreled with Epstein because of disagreement about the value of Abel Gance, who was by far the leading light in French cinema at the time. And
he of Napoleon.
That's correct.
Right.
He had done Napoleon.
Larue.
He had done Larue earlier on, which had been very, very important to the French cinema. It had immense resonance throughout Europe, not so much in America, but throughout Europe. It was important to the Soviet Union, for example. Then Napoleon, which had developed a number of new technical devices, including triple screen, the very famous triple screen. And unknown perhaps to Buñuel, Gance still had enough money to become one of Epstein, then an independent film producer's major backers. And for that, Epstein cast Gance's wife as the lead in La Chute de la Maison Usher, The Fall of the House of Usher, which he was shooting. And so Epstein owed him a great deal. And Buñuel, whose evaluation, his estimation of Buñuel was Gance was very different than Epstein's, refused to work with him. At that point, Epstein fired him and then commenced his career as an independent, somewhat in the margins even of the so-called narrative avant-garde in the 20s, of which Epstein, Gance, Dulac, and L'Herbier were the major figures. It was at that point, and somewhat significantly, Buñuel mentions it in his memoirs, Epstein warned him against becoming too closely associated with the Surrealists, who were then the rabble-rousers among the Parisian avant-garde. And in fact, Buñuel at that time had not had significant contact with that group, headed primarily by Breton. But naturally, when you moved in similar circles, eventually there was contact through, evidently, Man Ray and Aragon, Louis Aragon, who was the kind of adjutant to Breton at the time. And the first film that he made, Un Chien de Loup, an Andalusian dog, he co-made with Salvador Dali, the painter, was so overwhelming to Aragon and Man Ray, who saw it in a private screening, that they brought all their friends and launched Buñuel's career as a so-called surrealist filmmaker. And Buñuel, I feel, was looking for a group to affiliate himself with. The picture is actually a good deal murkier than we are led to believe sometimes by the scholarly accounts. There were a number of surrealist groups throughout the 20s that contested for priority. The best known, the one that has been translated the most, of course, is the group surrounding Breton and his manifestos. But the alternative groups were immensely important, I think, to Buñuel in a way that has never been seriously acknowledged. For example, the group surrounding Georges Bataille, which had many, many figures with whom Dali and Buñuel were very intimately linked personally.
If we might shift just for a second from the personalities to the kind of more general aesthetic background. It's certainly unfair to turn to you, Annette, and say, in 10 words or less, and I'll give you a lot more than that, let's refamiliarize ourselves with what some of the major notions of surrealism were. I mean, it's one of those words that now in our culture has been so deprived of the specificity of its meaning. I mean, people just say, oh, well, that's surrealist, and they don't really know what they're saying frequently. It refers to just a kind of large realm of odd experience in common parlance among people. Let's try to recover, if you would help me recover what it really meant in some ways, please.
Well, first of all, I think one should realize that when Buñuel arrives in Paris, he arrives very, very soon after the publication of the first Surrealist Manifesto. That is to say, he arrives really at the moment of the kind of effervescence of Surrealism, as conceived and directed by its founder, Breton. And I think one should not forget that these were young men who had grown up during the period, who had come to maturity during the First World War. Breton, in fact, had done his military service. They were also very aware that after the First World War, Europe, and in particular France, was by no means ready to relinquish the kinds of imperial designs which had dominated the politics of the 19th century. So that when Breton writes the first manifesto, he is aware that the French have in fact carried out the first civilian bombing in the War of the Rifts, carried on in North Africa. Therefore, surrealism has an impulse of resistance to imperial domination, which one sees spread throughout its literature. That is to say, it is not simply a subversive, but it has its roots in a kind of quasi-pacifist and somewhat revolutionary impulse. That's most important. Secondly, it recognizes, I think, with a kind of acuity which is confirmed by the visions of their contemporaries in other places, right. School of Frankfurt, for example, that the war and the current impasse on many levels of Western society in general is the product of rationality, is in a sense the end product of a certain hyperbolic rationality. And therefore, surrealism is attempting really to reestablish the primacy of a certain respect for impulse and that which is not subject to the rational integration into a totally mechanized and industrial society. Therefore, the emphasis on spontaneity, on automatic writing, on the state of dream, of oniric experiences, and the emphasis, of course, on that one domain, which is the domain of freedom by excellence, which is that of sexuality and eroticism.
Right. And that perhaps brings us to the point of why this film, one of the centers of why this film was viewed so scandalously. Before we came on together, I had pointed out to our audience that in fact this led to the theater being torn apart by a number of factions of the audience. Now, there were certain claims made that it was a technically crude film, that is, it violated this standard of sophistication, etc. But I don't think that's the real reason at all. I think you've already touched on it, that this film opens up areas of eroticism not portrayed, or certainly ever portrayed in this manner before in the cinema. How does it go about doing that, and what is it really doing when it's doing that? I mean, either of you? I mean, Annette?
Oh yes, I mean it's very much at the center of the film, and not only at the center of what we see, but it's very determinant of the way in which we see it. Yeah. Because, for example, in the film to begin with is a film in which essentially the action breaks off at many points. It's a film which is constituted, one could say, almost of a series of interrupted actions. The narrative of the very first part, the kind of long hike over the island, is somehow interrupted. These are characters who are introduced at the very beginning of the film. We never see them again. The lovers are constantly being torn away from each other. So that I think it is fair to say that the film in its form actually takes on the aspect of a kind of coitus interruptus. Right. That is, narrative expectations are constantly being frustrated, just as the sexual passion of the lovers at its center is being frustrated. That's one thing. And I'd like to point to one other aspect or one other parameter of the film, which I think is extremely important. And that takes place in the sequence which involves the founding of the city of Rome, during which, as you remember, we hear while the founding ceremony is actually being carried out. Screams which seem to come from off-screen space, somewhere else. And they're obviously the screams of a woman in travail. And when the camera shifts, when there's a shift and we see what is happening, we discover, of course, that this woman is part of a couple who are making love in the mud. Right? And so, in a sense, what's interesting about that, apart from what we see, is the fact that we as spectators have been led to believe that there is a woman being abused, perhaps murdered,
right.
attacked.
Right.
And what does that mean? It essentially means that we are put in the position of the child witnessing the erotic encounter of his parents in the classic Freudian definition of the primal scene. And it is not until the camera has shifted, that is to say, until we have been able to get a cognitive grasp of the whole scene and sequence, as it were, that we realize what is happening. That is to say, that we gain knowledge of the fact that this is not a scene of physical violence, but one rather of an erotic encounter. So what I want to say then is that the form of the film is that of a kind of coitus interruptus, and that we, as spectators, are introduced to the film in a position which is that of the child witnessing its parents in the primal scene.
This film certainly made a lot of people mad, and it's interesting that in doing so, it made a lot of people mad. They didn't claim necessarily it's eroticism, that may be under it, but it had a lot of opponents on political grounds.
Yes, as Annette mentioned, the political impulse in surrealism is something that often tends to get underrated today, especially in the United States. I think there's been a good deal of research in France recently that has restored that political dimension. A number of memoirs have reconfirmed that dimension. Briefly, in passing, they had a very long and tempestuous relationship with the fledgling Communist Party in France, and a number of the satellite political organizations around the Communist Party were expelled from the Communist Party. Breton himself, over a number of years, pursued Trotsky ultimately to Mexico in the late 30s, and that is something that one cannot forget, given the particular character of the group that attacked the film and was responsible for its banning shortly after its release in 1930 in Paris.
If I interrupt you just for a second, Stuart, it might be interesting just to talk about, not even so much to talk about the political folly of World War I, but today it's difficult, I think, for some of us to recover initially the carnage of that war. One of the exercises I occasionally use in class to try to drive that home, I think it makes a point, is that I'll have all my male students count to 5. And I'll say every 5th male student can now leave the room, because if you had been a student in 1913 in France or England of your class, of your generation, all of you would be dead. Every 5th student in the male student would be dead, and that's not even to talk about the 3rd and the 4th student, shall we say, and what emotional or physical damage the war had done to them. So the context we're talking about is so cataclysmic, and that's one of the things that strikes me is not recovered frequently in a discussion of surrealism, how much the violence they're doing aesthetically is a response to the violence they've just seen occur to their generation and to those that surrounded them.
Was, I think Annette so trenchantly remarked, the bottom line, as it were, was to put rationality in its entirety into question. That paralleled a number of efforts across Europe at the time to do so from very different theoretical perspectives. The stress in surrealism was less on elaborate social diagnosis, as you might find in the critical school in Frankfurt, but rather on the possible therapeutic, complementary, suppressed aspects of human consciousness and spirit, very broadly. And those have to do with eroticism, with the dream, with madness, with various kinds of exotic religious practices. And throughout the 20s, if you follow their magazine, La Révolution Surréaliste, the Surrealist Revolution, and its successor publications, you find a series of experiments, if you will, that almost couched in scientific terms, ironically, but a series of experiments with different kinds of conceptual orders that might pose a viable alternative to the rationality that had been so discredited by the war.
And using different models, I suppose, for those. I mean, obviously, I guess we can think of the dream as one model, an erotic encounter, and the change in the consciousness rendered as such as another model.
But there is, I think, another model which one might propose as part of the therapy which Stuart mentioned, and that is shock therapy. Yeah. Because I think that the very violent reaction to the film was, in a sense, if not predictable, in a certain sense, very understandable and very justifiable. That is to say, the positioning of the spectator in the way that I have just described, I think, in a way, helps us to understand why that reaction was so violent. Another, for example, which is instantiated in the celebrated scene on the toilet. I mean, here are two separated lovers having erotic fantasies, and these fantasies, they have made love in the mud. And these fantasies occur, you know, in the bathroom, on the toilet, in that place, you know, which is as far from the romanticized, idealized notion of love that we generally are familiar with, and particularly in movies. And not only that, but when the chain is pulled, the screen is flooded, totally flooded and occupied by excrement. That is to say, the audience is confronted with a screen full of excrement, a sequence which I always feel should have been very dear to Georges Bataille. And that is to say, what is involved in both the eroticism and in what one might call the politics of eroticism is a kind of desublimation process, which is radical, and which is, again, I think, a form of shock therapy, if you like.
Yeah. I was wondering, this is one of the first sound films in France, and so it's part of that whole sound revolution. As many people know, there was a great debate, I mean, across Europe at that time about what the proper and significant uses of sound may be. This is, one might say, an odd film to be one of the first sound films. Some of us would say it's appropriate that it's one of the first sound films. How does the uses of the soundtrack, Stuart, connect with these strategies of shock therapy, these strategies of implicating the spectator? I mean, Annette's already mentioned the cry of the woman in the mud, but what are some of the other things going on there?
Well, actually, according to Buñuel, and I think the records would more or less bear him out, L'Âge d'Or, which was financed, by the way, and I think we ought to get this in, by the very famous Comte de Noailles, who was a major patron of the avant-garde in France, particularly the Surrealists, who had also simultaneously, more or less, funded Jean Cocteau's film that became Le Sang d'un Poète, The Blood of a Poet. In any case, it was one of the first experiments with sound. The French industry initially, like most industries across the world, was wary. Significantly, Epstein was very, very positive, as was Gans. The first studios were set up very, very late, in part in France, because France did not own the sound processes. These had to be imported from Germany and the United States. And one characteristic of, general characteristic of these early French films is a kind of somewhat malevolent wit in the use of sound. Renoir's first sound film, made I think the same year or perhaps slightly before, was called En Pourge Bébé. And in it there was the sound of a flushing toilet. And for this, Renoir was soundly criticized, and for him it was simply an experiment to see what sound level could be sustained by this equipment. You have this in the flushing of the toilet, the sudden flushing of the toilet, which he very carefully specifies in his script, must link up with the images in such a way as to suggest a simultaneous process. What's characteristic of the film is a very powerful splitting of sound and image, and the use of silence in a by then sound medium. You have the most famous, perhaps, sequence is when the heroine of the movie, who was played by a fairly unknown French actress named Liebman, she is waiting and dreaming about her lover, Gaston Meudon, who is still in captivity. And she sits at a mirror. It's one of the most beautiful images in the film, I think. And in the mirror you see she's sitting in a room, of course, and in the mirror you see reflections of clouds which have been somehow superimposed. And the wind blows through her hair, through a source, from a source that you cannot identify easily. And you hear the sound of cowbells, which ultimately link up to the space in which her lover, Gaston Meudon, is being led.
I think also one of the things that's important about surrealism is in film is their entire attitude toward not only dialogue but language and text in general. Because, you know, it took a long time for the surrealists, well, it took a few years, let's say, to get that generous funding from the Vicomte de Noailles, so that for a long time they felt that their films were being made by the German expressionists and by the Soviets. Potemkin they saw as the first real surrealist film. But when they came to make films of their own, they made a particular use of film titles in the forms of puns and rather enigmatic and kind of riddle-like texts. And when they come to make their first sound film, they are still using the form of the pun, both visual and in sound, so that the bandaged finger of the Alice is actually a pun on a very particular kind of sexual erotic idiom. So that's, I think, important among the surrealists. They introduce not only sound, but they carry over from their silent films and from the whole repertory of, by that time, established convention in surrealist painting, surrealist art generally, a tradition of play with language and with sound.
This is this Buñuel's last purely surrealist film? And everybody considers him a surrealist throughout his career in this aspect and all, but I mean, one of the great things about this film was that there were no restrictions put upon him. And is this the end point in some way, or how would you? Well,
I think it's without question that he made this film very much under the auspices of the surrealist group. There is in fact a manifesto, although they had nothing to do with the creation of the scenario that I'm aware of. There was a manifesto in its defense. It became a hot political issue to which they contributed their own, what is this, oil in the fire or what have you. And a number of them participated in the making of the film, including Jacques and Pierre Prévert, the poets, and Max Ernst plays the lead bandit who reports to the rest of them that the Mallorcans have come, the Mallorcan bishops. So that in many, many obvious ways it's a work that was validated and under the wing of the surrealists. He continued to work with people on the periphery of the group, including Pierre Unique, in his next film, which he made in Spain in 19...
But I think there is one thing that one can say about his relationship to surrealism as his career kind of continues. And that is that essentially what happens to surrealism in Buñuel, or through Buñuel, reflects what happens to surrealism generally. That is to say, the relationship is never totally broken. It's extended and modified and varied. It's never totally broken. But he no longer, I think, as he goes on in his career, and it's not simply that he continues, but the history of film evolves and all kinds of possibilities are open to him. I think what happens is that he merges in a kind of Magritte-like continuum into the history of film itself. And so that a lot of the impulses and a lot of the iconographic elements of surrealism are absorbed into a continued dialogue with the form of narrative.
Continued dialogue is a good place for us to stop because we don't have any more time today. If you'd like more information about this film series or about Cinema Studies graduate or undergraduate at the College of Staten Island, please send us a self-addressed stamped envelope to the following address: Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that address for you, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York. I hope that our discussion here leads you to discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us today.